All right, and tonight we have the privilege of hearing from our friend Eleanor Finley, who first came to the ISC, I think, shortly before Occupy Wall Street began, and got very immersed in that movement, and shared a lot of ideas both ways during those years, and has stayed in touch and went on to get a PhD in anthropology at UMass, and over the course of that spent a lot of years traveling and studying like-minded movements in various parts of the world, and produced this wonderful book, Practicing Social Ecology, which we'll be hearing about this evening. Eleanor is a political anthropologist specializing in social movements, democracy studies, and social ecology, with a focus on global grassroots activists, on how global grassroots activists synergize deep democracy, social justice, and ecological sustainability. Welcome, Eleanor.
Thank you guys for being here this evening, and thank you to the Institute for inviting me and for raising me. It really feels like coming home to share what I've been working on for a long time through the foundation that I've gotten from the social ecology and the Institute, and the ongoing education that this organization provides and that this community at large provides. So I'm just really honored to be a part of it and to be here with you guys. And I'm also really tired this evening, so forgive me if I'm a little bit rambly. I think we have like an hour and a half to chat. And what I have is really just some thoughts prepared about how this book came to be and the parts of myself that went into it, and hopefully relating to some of the history of the Institute. And then I was going to talk a little bit about what's in the book and kind of explain really why I chose to put in what I did. And, you know, like any book, it's like you have enough room for some things, and then there's other stuff you don't have room for, and all of that. So I'm not really going to go into an explanation of social ecology. Unfortunately, I just don't have time, because I also want to make a little bit of time for some discussion and to talk with folks here about your experiences with social ecology and really with practicing social ecology. It's in the title of the book, and I think it's actually something I started out with kind of flippantly. Like, I was like, oh, okay, let's try to make this a little bit more practice-oriented. And then as I was writing the book, I started to really think on a deeper level about what really counts as social ecology practice. And I've spent a lot of time reflecting on all of the different ways that people have chosen to practice social ecology. And it's not often something that we talk about in these spaces. Social ecology is very theory-heavy. But there's actually such a rich tradition of putting these ideas into practice that we're all a part of, and then we're always rethinking the ideas, and that evolution is something that is something that I want to bring into the room this evening, and I'm hoping we can like have some discussion with each other about what we think about the evolution of social ecological practice and what's changed over time. What ideas have we maybe challenged through the practice, and then what new ideas have arisen or what ideas have gotten reinforced. So that's kind of our agenda for this evening. Like I said, I'm a little bit rambly. I'm not going to be super tight on time. But yeah, so I want to start by talking about the story of how this book came to be. And I want to go back actually kind of into my own story because I think this book is very much a product of how I came to encounter social ecology, and I find that that's a really personal and meaningful story for each of us, you know, our own sort of journey into seeing the world in a really different way. So for me, I grew up in the pretty affluent suburbs of Washington, D.C. A lot of my friends' parents worked in the federal government. Like I was just mentioning to Kathleen, you know, like I had friends growing up whose parents were like in the CIA. And I got this kind of strange inner like peek to the state. And I had no language for that at the time. But into, you know, into the state and how it works. And then as I got a bit older, the anti-globalization movement was going on in DC. I think, I'm sure that there's folks that I've met at the Institute who I was probably in the same places with in Washington, DC in the early 2000s. And I was just an adolescent at the time, but that was a very radicalizing experience. And again, sort of little did I know, but there was some social ecology already in my world. And then I went to school in Richmond, Virginia, which was a very eye-opening experience. And in part because DC is a very multicultural place, and especially growing up in the 90s at the time, there's this idea of like, well, we've gone past racism, we've gone past all of these social issues, and Richmond is like this wake-up call. You're in the former capital of the Confederacy, the color line is a very deep divide, there's a lot of poverty, and yet there's also a very strong current of activism, a lot of anarchists. And I say all of this because this is all coming back around now, because there's a People's Assembly in Richmond, Virginia, that's very social ecology inspired, very sort of explicitly in conversation with Bookchin's ideas, and I've been a part of that, and we're consistently getting like 100, 125 people at our assemblies, and the assemblies are broken out into neighborhood groups. But anyway, so I went to school in Richmond, Virginia. I studied philosophy, which I think gave me the conceptual tools to understand social ecology when I encountered it and engage with that theory. And then the financial crisis hit of 2008. I think probably most folks here remember what that was like. There was a major unemployment crisis for people my age who were just graduating college. And at that time, I was underemployed, I was waiting tables, wasn't making, you know, tips were bad. And I was kind of sick of living in Richmond. And I was looking for like what else is out there. And I was interested in ecology. I was reading some anarchist work. I was interested in deep ecology a little bit. That was just sort of around. And then I had some friends who were going to a commune in Western Massachusetts. And I called them up and said, hey, what are you up to? And they said, hey, we're moving to a commune in Western Massachusetts, like you should come. And so that's what I did, and I ended up staying in this commune for a summer, and I fell in love with Western Massachusetts, and I thought, I really need to stay here. There's some really good stuff going on. And then through that, where I was looking for work, I ended up meeting Haya Heller, and like I was her kid's babysitter for a while, and we were chatting about politics, and she said, oh, have you heard about this guy, Murray Bookchin? And I was like, I don't know, like, who's that? But I had been reading about SDS, you know, I sort of had this vague awareness. And then like a lot of folks, it just totally like blew my socks off. And then I was in a study group in Western Massachusetts with Haya, with some of the folks who were also in sort of this commune world. And then it was in 2011 that I first arrived at the Institute. And this was sort of through Haya's mentorship. And I facilitated my first meeting in 2011 at the Institute. I remember being really nervous and really scared about the idea of being a facilitator. Like that was like a, that idea of being at the center of the room was really scary at the time. And I feel like now I'm helping other folks step into that role in Richmond, where, as we're doing the assemblies, we're trying to train folks and being facilitators and sitting at the center of the room. And so from there, I won't share my whole life story, but I started writing, I started speaking. I was really encouraged by folks like Dan and like Brian and like Grace and Paul to pursue my education, to look into ethnography, studying social movements. And I was able to get into the anthropology program at UMass. And at the time, I really wanted to study the Indignados movement. That was still kind of ongoing, like the Spanish version of Occupy. And I had the opportunity to go and do fieldwork in Catalonia and the Basque Country. I was studying for my master's unconventional movements to fossil fuels. And at the time, the anti-fracking movement here was a big deal. The anti-Keystone pipeline in Texas was a big deal. We organized some intensives in Western Mass and one in Texas with the Keystone XL pipeline blockade. And so my evolution in my career as an academic always had this parallel kind of life to what was going on in the Institute and what was going on politically when the Rojava Revolution happened, actually before the Rojava Revolution. And I can't remember if I put this anecdote in the book, but I remember in 2013 at the ISC gathering, we were standing in front of Dan's barn, and we were getting bagels for lunch, and I was like standing in line, and we were sitting with like our cream cheese, and Brian goes, "Oh, have you heard there's this like ethnic minority in Eastern Turkey that's implementing Murray's ideas?" And like Janet has been working with them, and there's this book that these German internationalists wrote about their system, and we would really like somebody to review it. Is there anybody who wants to review it? And I remember being like, oh, cool, I want to know about that. And that book was the, I think it's Tartor, I don't remember how to pronounce, report from 2011 that they had done from going to Bakur, the northern part of Kurdistan, and wrote about the revolutionary movement there that was developing in conversation with social ecology, and they were calling it democratic confederalism. And so from there, I was really fascinated by the Kurdish movement. Again, this is 2013, so this was before even the Battle of Kobani. Battle of Kobani was a decisive moment and turning point, and since then we've seen the drama of the Rojava Revolution. I spent my dissertation research working with Kurdish revolutionaries who had gone from Syria and moved to Germany and also the UK, and was really involved in the diaspora and was interested in how the diaspora was changing the left in Europe, and that's it's very, very palpable, certainly in the years 2017, 2018. And I was doing that, and I was trying to finish my doctorate on that topic when COVID-19 hit. I was in the midst of research. I was in London. I was working with the assemblies there. I was taking Kurmanji classes, and in those Kurmanji classes, there were internationalists who were going back and forth to Rojava, and everything stopped, right? And so this is where kind of the book comes in. And like I said, I promise all this, like, seems trivial, trivial life story stuff comes together in the book. Because by this point, I was starting to think about, like, well, do I really want to be an academic? I knew in the beginning of my career and as a graduate student that I wanted to keep writing about social movements. I wanted to keep being involved and engaged. But as things sort of progressed, I think like a lot of folks felt like I'm not really at home here. And I don't understand I don't understand why I'm being asked to do the things that I'm being asked to do, which is produce academic texts that are self-referential and, are read by 5 people. And so at the time, I was like, there's this connection here between social ecology and what was going on in New England, and then what I was seeing going on in Spain and Barcelona. And we all know Barcelona and Camus, was this, it's now globally sort of recognized model of experimenting with what they see as like the interstitial space between social movements and institutional politics, right? So they're trying to break the break the limitations of social movements and enter institutions of local government and transform them. And then obviously there was Rojava, and so there was this like constellation that I was seeing and was able to see firsthand, and I really wanted a way to convey to other people in my life and the people that I knew back home what this world was about. So again, I promise all these things sort of come together, and they say like you write the book that you want to see in the world, and what I really wanted to see was a book that could explain social ecology in non-academic terms, so not an academic argument or analyzing Bookchin's work, but that could be accessible enough to give people a foundation, and maybe we're not, I think you probably have to have, it helps to have some college education to be able to read the book, right? I'm not claiming to be like perfectly accessible. But the book I wanted to see in the world was something that could explain social ecology to an intelligent person, and that wasn't written in, academies, and also was relatively short, that wasn't too taxing. The book that I really wanted to see was rooted in contemporary concerns, and was able to speak about things like people who are undocumented, and the notion of citizenship and how fraught that is for most people, and a book that could talk about social ecology and also be able to speak to the notion of decolonization. And so I was really eager for to share with the people in my life that I knew from back home in Richmond, back home in DC, and just kind of generally the middle class, these kind of like white and multicultural middle class spaces that I was inhabiting, that weren't based in New England. I think like social ecology is this really wonderful presence like throughout New England, and then it sometimes feels like when you leave here that there's like this kind of like veil that you pass through. So I really wanted to create something that felt like it could resonate with people that I knew from the worlds that I was familiar with. And then lastly, I really wanted to see something that was speaking to the practice piece of it. I found that as I gave talks about social ecology and was giving introductions to the theory, that the first question folks have is often, okay, well, like that sounds great, but what does it look like in practice, And this is where, as social ecologists, we're often in a position of saying, like, well, there's this really incredible experiment in Rojava, there's this incredible experiment in Barcelona, you know, there's the Burlington Greens, and it felt like, wow, wouldn't it be great just to have like a one-stop shop, you know, like just a book you can hand somebody and say, you know, here, this will get you up to speed on some of the main examples. And that's how things started when I began the book, and then, as I said earlier, as I started to work on it more and more, I found myself motivated by the idea of capturing some of the insights that we've gotten from these experiments, you know? I think in some ways the social ecology movement hasn't given itself enough credit in capturing all of the different work that we're doing to try to realize these principles, you know, and maybe we're not, you know, able to just snap our fingers and have a utopian federal direct democracy, you know, that's run by principles of post-scarcity and non-hierarchy, but we do things all the time, every day, to enact a principle of non-hierarchy, or to work towards post-scarcity, to build a post-scarcity condition, or to expand people's imaginations to conceive of there being post-scarcity at all, right? Like this is, you know, I think of the work that that Brian and other climate justice activists do to fight against narratives that say, well, we can just techno-fix our way out of the climate crisis, right? And in fact, we need a much deeper change in our relationship to energy, to technology. And so that imaginative work that's a way of building towards post-scarcity. And then lastly, as an anthropologist, I was finding that directly democratic experiments and traditions exist all over the world. And that in some ways has been like one of the most exciting things about work that I've been able to read and engage with. And I think that, you know, certainly since Murray was with us, we're just learning more and more all the time. How, by orders of magnitude, you know, like you go back and you read Murray's work and he's talking about Athenian democracy, and now we know that Athens is actually probably one of the more regressive examples of democracy in the Mediterranean at that time, and that in fact there were actually, you know, hundreds of assemblies that were going on. And it just so happens that Athenians were writing down their decisions on stone and throwing them in the trash. Archaeology is all about just like digging through the trash. And so, yeah, so there's been all this incredible scholarship around directly democratic forms. And I think there's also been so much work and struggle coming from indigenous peoples and indigenous groups who are resurrecting their languages and their histories, and we're also sort of rethinking how we make sense of indigenous politics, because indigenous people for a very long time by the West were considered to not have politics, right? They're pre-political. And I think even to a certain extent, Murray kind of reproduces that binary, right? Of citizenship is about concern for everyone, and tribe is about concern only for your bloodline, right? And I think that we're seeing now with indigenous thought, and as, you know, there's more open communication intellectually between the global north and the global south and center and periphery, that it's not so simple, right? And that many of these political histories of indigenous people are examples of the liberatory impulse and the liberatory form. And so I'm sort of going off on a tangent right now, but, you know, again, so in the book that I wanted to write, it was engaged in some of these conversations and trying to really think of social ecology as a living tradition It's not just, I believe very strongly that like it is not just something that some guy wrote, and we're all sitting here like interpreting it. And he himself hated that. And I don't know, I never met the guy, so maybe he would be fine with all of us just like, like going through his text. But like, and my mind, I really want to see social ecology as a living tradition, and also one that is able to thrive in a pluralistic world, right? Like there is that sort of colonial epistemic critique here that, social ecology needs to be able to live alongside other vocabularies and ways of, of thinking about liberation, or it's not liberatory. So when I think of like, why did I write this book? So there's sort of like what I wanted, and then, and why I wanted that, I wanted to see like a proof of concept, that these ideas really are as powerful as we think they are, which means they have to live outside of one person, which means they have to be dynamic. And again, which means that we all have to take seriously the notion of praxis, right? That like, okay, we have the theory, we have like the best of what we can kind of conceive, we're gonna work with it in reality, and then we're gonna say, okay, what does reality have to say about what we thought? And then go back to the drawing board and come up with a new picture. And so that's sort of what went into the book. And how am I on time, really quick? What's the time right now?
10 to 8.
What's that?
10 to 8.
10 to 8. We're supposed to end at 8:15.
Mm.
8:45.
Oh, 8:45. Okay, yeah, we have plenty of time. Okay, yeah, no, we're good. Right on time. Yeah, so that's sort of, that's what went into the book and what I wanted to see and sort of the goals that went into it. And then what I actually ended up doing was writing an introduction to social ecology. Again, that was oriented towards people who have some interest, In the very beginning of the introduction, I talk about Google Murray Bookchin and how like I wanted to see something that people could reach for past the Google Murray Bookchin point that, again, was contemporary, all of those things and, explanatory. So in terms of the book, I wrote, an introduction to social ecology, sort of both in theory and in practice. Kind of broke social ecology down into four concepts, which is not dialectical. And I'm sure, like, when I'm not around folks, I'm like, oh my God, it's so not dialectical. And it's true, it's not dialectical, but I don't know, but it's kind of what was needed was a breakdown of some of these concepts. So I talk about first and second nature, domination and non-domination, scarcity or post-scarcity, and sort of thinking through technology, and then federal direct democracy. That's sort of what I say. Like, if we really have to boil this down to like 4 things, this is what we're looking at. And then in the praxis chapters, I write about the personal and the intrapersonal scale, and sort of the idea that breaking through hierarchy is not just, it's not just something that's going to be achieved through Robert's rules. Like, we really have to have a very deep reckoning with ourselves, and actually many of the social ecologists I admire most, and I think have made some of the most significant contributions to how we think and practice democracy, have had a very deep understanding of the reconciliation that we all have to experience personally and also interpersonally, and how we relate to each other. And as I started writing, I started to really think about this as like, oh, this really is the reconciliation of nature and society on different scales. And, just that the alienation that we've all been taught to accommodate and live with happens, it's like a zipper. It's like it happens at every scale and it just goes up and up and up. So I organized the chapters on practice by scale. So I sort of start with that interpersonal level, which also is kind of an intervention because I think sometimes we need a bit of a reminder about that like we have to carry this wherever we go. And when people say, well, how does you do this in practice? And you say, well, direct democracy, the government can come and break up a meeting anytime it wants. But when you really carry the revolutionary seed inside of yourself, no one can stop you from practicing the revolution. No one can stop you from being revolutionary. So I started there. And then I talk about the community scale and thinking through relationships with nature and building eco-communities. And that chapter comes a lot out of my reading of Dan's work and thinking about social ecology, not just as something that human beings are doing together, but a relationship with nature and this idea of having eco-communities. And I remember a conversation we had a number of years ago now where you're sort of like, well, I really feel like something was lost when we were no longer working with the land. And there's something lost in a vision of democracy that doesn't involve our relationship to the natural world. So, writing a book is hard and it's also a lot of fun because you get to like do a little bit of like psyops, and like, so one of those things is I wanted to kind of like push that idea forward again, that like, okay, well, we really, direct democracy by itself is not the political vision that we're talking about. It also involves this ongoing relationship. And I was reflecting on what those experiments had come up with. I talk a bit about an eco-commune in Barcelona called Camasteu. And one of the folks the reason I was able to hang out there at all, because they don't like visitors necessarily from, but I got to hang out there because one of their members, this guy Martin, did a tree sit in 2001 or something. And he's British, and he like got taken in by like border patrol or whatever. And like Brian, I guess you bailed him out of jail. And he was like, oh yeah, ISE, Brian Tokar like helped me like get out of jail. He was like, yeah, you guys are really cool. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's sort of that chapter, and then
He came here and stayed with us when we were organizing for some event. I don't remember which one.
Yeah, he had a one-legged parrot and was in like a house that he constructed in Camasteu, and that was surrounded by a wall with like glass that they had set up to stop the police from evicting them, and they almost got evicted, and Martin was like one of the last holdouts, like super militant. But then the neighborhood showed up to stop their eviction. And the neighborhood showed up because they were, again, because they were informed by social ecology, even if, Bookchin is one of their influences, and they're thinking about, they have their own way of conceiving this. It's not just they're like, oh yeah, Bookchin, and we're going to implement it. But anyway, that case study really speaks to the power of, where people are protecting each other and we're also protecting the ecology that we are working with. And then the last two praxis chapters, I talk about assemblies and my experience in Occupy Wall Street. I started to try to think through some of the differences and similarities between community assemblies and social movement assemblies. Like there's this kind of typology that we discuss in social ecology, and I wanted to write about that. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, Yeah. Just, again, getting 20 people into a room. I'm now really zealous about what is, actually kind of the limits of direct democracy. I feel like I started out being like, direct democracy is everything. And now I'm like, hey, wait a second. But getting 20 people into a room and having them make decisions, like that's also not democracy, right? Like is a kind of democracy, but that's not the same as bringing the people who live in a place together to make decisions about their everyday lives. And it's not the same as working across boundaries of class and culture and, you know, racialization and all of these things. You know, that in many ways, that's the real difficult work of democracy. So I've come away from this experience really thinking about that. And then in the last chapter, I talk about federations, and that starts to get a little bit more abstract, right? Because we're all just kind of making things up as we go along. We also know that federations are way more prevalent in human history than we might have realized. And like, actually, I think it's an undervalued part of Murray's work that, you know, he really spent a lot of time finding federations and you know, really thinking through like what would it mean to have a free society, and how could we have that complexity. Another argument that social ecology runs into is, or any, you know, movement for direct democracy, is this idea that the world is too complicated for these kinds of politics, right? And so the notion of federation is an answer to that. But again, we're all still kind of trying to figure it out. And yeah, so that was that chapter. And yeah, they're sort of arranged by scale. Actually, I think that was another, I have to give that credit for that to another comrade who had a look at early drafts, Kevin Van Meter, who's really lovely. He was like, oh yeah, you should change, this would be really cool, and it worked really well. And then lastly, and maybe we can get into some discussion, what I didn't do, I didn't write very much about cooperatives and participatory economics. I have a short section about it, but I didn't write about it because I didn't feel like I knew enough to really go there. And since then, there's been a lot more development in the solidarity economy movement, and I think actually the solidarity economy movement in many ways is starting to push into assemblies. You know, like there's a really interesting development there where they're saying like, wait a second, do we just mean the economy? Are we just gonna co-op our way to, you know, non-capitalism? So I didn't do that, and I'm really eager for more theory to be developed there. And I didn't do a super deep dive into some recent organizations. I sort of realized that publishing things and really naming names is always like a bit of a, you know, challenge and a balance. Like, and yeah, and then also since I wrote the book, like I said, there's been a People's Movement Assembly in Richmond, Virginia, and I actually feel like I have been able to see these politics in a much more intimate way, especially because it's, you know, a city that I know and care about. And I'll leave it there. Thank you guys so much for supporting it. So we can do just like Q&A, but it also could be fun. I had an activity that I was interested to have folks do, which is to reflect for a few minutes, either sort of privately or even writing stuff down on paper. Like one time where you really felt like these ideas were being put into practice.
Say again?
A moment, like to reflect privately on a moment, and then we can share, on a moment or a period when you felt like these ideas were really being put into practice, you know, where you had that like aha, like, oh, this is what, you know, this is what social ecology really means, you know, and just to think about like what was going on in that moment, who was there, like what were you actually doing, where you felt like, okay, we're really practicing this right now. That was my thought as like a little brainstorm exercise. And if folks are interested in doing that, we could, or we can just do Q&A. I don't know. Are there folks who get twinkles, or folks who like that? What's that?
Yeah.
Can we do both?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but it's just a matter of which one do we want to do right now?
Let's do your exercise.
Okay, yeah, let's do the exercise. Okay,
Yeah.
take a moment, think to yourselves, grab a notebook.
Can you show us the book?
Yeah, it's over here.
Please?
I brought some copies. I don't have a ton, but here's the book. Maybe you can pass it around. It was published by Pluto Press. And, I never finished my story about how it came to be. I strong-armed my advisor into accepting an academic, non-academic crossover book and then an academic journal article. I was like, this is the book I have in me, my field work is destroyed. What? I was like, I can either do this or like leave the program and write it. So, to be fair, it was really like courageous and generous of her to let me take a non-traditional path. But that's what, yeah.
You know, about book publishing, my recent book, I decided to go with an actual publisher, a major publisher. And I think I've sort of regretted it. They sold out, and now I know that, well, I have lots of students in third world countries, the global south, they can't afford the book.
Yeah.
Academic books are like ridiculously
Yeah.
expensive.
Oh,
Mine came
Lord.
out at $87 to start with.
Yeah.
And the Kindle edition is just about as expensive. Now I discovered the company they sold to, Emerald in the UK, you can decide ahead of time that you want an open source book. And I've never made any money from my academic books. I mean,
Yeah.
grocery money, you know. I could have done an open source and
Yeah.
it would
How
have
much
been
wider
much
readership.
smarter, you know,
Yeah.
as I look back. I can't make it open source now because they said, oh, that wouldn't be fair to the people who paid for it. Like what, all 10 of them?
Yeah.
How did you think about that? I mean, I think if I were doing it now, I would always do an open source book and just know that I wasn't gonna make it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think technically this is, my book is open source. It's
It
just
is?
through, it's not.
Oh, no.
Right. It's just through a small leftist publisher. I mean, again, I got kind of lucky. I was living in Italy at the time, so chapters of my life ago. I was living in Italy. The pandemic was raging and ongoing, and a friend of the Institute, Marina Citrin, was bringing together a team to write an anthology about mutual aid projects around the world related to COVID-19, because mutual aid projects cropped up all over the planet to respond to COVID-19. And so she knew I was in Italy, and she said, are you interested in writing a chapter about what you're seeing? And I said, yeah, absolutely. So I did that, and I helped contribute to that anthology, which was being published through this publisher, Pluto Press. And Pluto's published other really amazing social ecology texts. Like they published.
Expensive?
No, I mean this is $22.
That's inexpensive, yeah.
Yeah, and so I developed a relationship with the publisher through that experience. I also helped edit I did some free editing for them for what became Pandemic Solidarity. And so they knew I could edit well enough, and they said when I put together a proposal, they were excited about hearing it. And they this press also published a book by Dilar Dirac about the Kurdish women's movement, and they're very sort of social ecology friendly. So I don't know if other folks are interested in writing things. I found Pluto Press to be a pretty good outlet. They have really good distribution, stuff like that. But again, I have this nice little exercise. If folks want to take a minute, go inward and think about when you really feel like you were like, yeah, this is hitting.
Oh, yeah.
All right, folks want to come back together? Is there anyone who'd like to share? Maybe have like an aha moment that stuck out? And of course, you can have. Corey, you want to go first?
Sure, I'm really excited to share this. I've talked to you about some of this before, but, so in Boston, the neighborhood I live in is a diverse, gentrifying neighborhood, but it is blessed with what I observed as a lot of land commons that were managed by neighbors, diverse neighbors, and I wanted to do something that helped people understand their neighborhood in their place as being in nature, not separate from nature, and that us being, and recognizing these commons as these values, social ecology values, indigenous values are the same in this regard. When I walked the neighborhood with another neighbor who managed a food forest. I also steward a food forest at the library. We took state land, avoided a confrontation until recently. So one question is about how conflict in social ecology, that's another thing. But we both had this experience of converting land into commons, sometimes just directly taking the land and the people engaging to grow food in common, to share, to teach each other, to have people who wouldn't talk to each other, encounter each other in a space around fruit trees and growing techniques and intergenerational stuff and all that. So there was green infrastructure in the neighborhood. There were school gardens, educational gardens. There was a refugee gardener who was growing and so when we were walking together, she's like, we have to tell these stories so that the neighborhood comes to understand itself as a place and sharing these separate projects as being our neighborhood and our place as a potential benefit that would bring us into this democratic situation. So just one, I'll end by saying that, well, we did this project, it's the Gardens of Eggleston. We produced, it had, we produced the zine, which I have more of if you haven't gotten one. We also engaged a storyteller anthropologist to individually tell, there are 5 mini documentaries that are telling the story of the gardeners and the relation to the land and to the neighbors and each other and economic pressures and climate and all this. But we can't quite wrap up the project. It still goes on, which is the last thing we did is we walked the neighborhood. We went to the garden. Neighbors came together and walked the neighborhood together to these spaces. And it doesn't happen very often that people, do this. And we came to Doris's house. Doris is just a gardener who is very wise about how to grow food in the city. She has agroecology knowledge related to growing food in the city, right? And we're there and she says, oh, I'm gonna lose my garden next year because the developer who built that luxury housing development over there my landlord has sold the land to him and I'm gonna lose my growing space. And she shares food in the neighborhood. She's already connected through that act of not commodifying food, into the neighborhood. And so we're walking there and we have many different people with different connections and we look across the street from Doris, which is also across from a school, and there's a city lot. And we all have this moment of, we need to have control of this land. This land needs to be neighborhood land, not city land per se, but Doris needs a place to grow her food. The children need a place to grow their food. Our library, we've been so successful that they're tearing down the library to build a beautiful new library with no food for us. But in other words, we're evolving. And it comes to the encounter that leads to the direct action or the social action or the collective decision making and the weaving together and doing stuff. So that's, I think, that's it.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Dan can help me with this. I think the time that Social Ecology, the Institute, was involved in the most dramatic political involvement was when the Institute was at Cape Farm, and we had windmills, we had windmills made out of cans and solar that way before anybody was doing it. It was an absolutely unique technological thing. Biodynamic gardening. So, well, during that time, the anti-nuke movement burst open on the coast at Seabrook. And we all played a very big role in that. The Social Ecology, both as organizers, and simple things like the whole notion of affinity groups, which Murray had brought forward, bringing from the Spanish anarchists. And that was the first time since the movement of the 60s, which was totally hierarchical and male-dominated, that was the first time that affinity groups emerged. Feminism influenced that. But it was he who theoretically brought that forward. So we were having a tremendous influence on the broader movement in America. And during that time, and Dan, you got to help me with this, because we remember this, and it hasn't been really historically broken down and thought about the successes and mistakes of that moment. But some of us, I can't remember who, were designated to go to the founding movement of the Green Party in the United States, in Minneapolis, St. Paul.
I was there.
And I've always been very proud of the fact that I called the groups that formed committees of correspondence, which I know Murray was very strong on that part of the revolution that was, American Revolution, that was really based in local communities. And so we had the committees of correspondence, and there were several of us who went to that meeting to form the Green Party of America. Simultaneously, of course, we're very much inspired by and I actually was with Murray in Europe meeting Green Party people, the Grünen. This was a time, it seems to me, the time when the Institute, Social Ecology, all of us were really engaged at a political level that was national, actually. And there were two forces there, and I can't say that I'm going to give you a really comprehensive breakdown. I've only been thinking about it as you've been talking, but there were two forces. One was the deep ecology, which Murray was one of his most forceful battles. As I remember, one of the lines was, AIDS is nature's way of reducing, there was that kind of notion. So we had that on one side. And on the other side was a kind of electoral politics that was difficult. I hate to lay it all on Howie Hawkins, but Howie, he's run for senator and governor and all of that. But Howie's a great guy. But so here we were in the middle of people on one side saying that a ecological, sustainable, non-hierarchical movement has to wall off America, and had this on the other hand, let's run off and run for office, and especially at a national level, which was, and the Burlington Greens were really in some way a response to that. So I don't think we've ever, as a community, have really gone back and really analyzed closely the failures and the successes of that moment. where we were playing a role on the national stage, it may very well be that in fact we did the right thing, which was to kind of oppose the two sides, but didn't come out with anything beyond that. Maybe the Burlington Greens were the only thing. Deanne, how close am I with this?
Youth Greens. Yeah, I mean, the founding was very fraught, that's for sure. But, you know, there was a clear sense, I think, when we left, that it was not to be a national party running candidates, but it was to be a decentralized network of committees of correspondence, and then let's see how that builds. And it was really, I feel like there was a coup that Stretnack and Harry Boyd and some of the others pulled, and to sort of ignored the will of the people at the founding convention and went ahead and decided it was time to start a party. Brian certainly has a lot to say about that. He was deeply involved in the left Greens and the opposition.
Yeah.
At that point, I'd already sort of thrown up my hands on the Greens and said,
I mean, there was a period of a few years when there was a network of 150, 200 locals around the country that were organizing the way we envisioned the Greens should be. And, you know, how he was driving around in his car on 3 hours sleep a night, organizing all these green groups.
Yeah.
So before going deeper into this conversation, were there any others that came up that folks wanted to?
But I was just gonna say one more thing, which was, there was, you know, at the national meetings, the overwhelming majority were in favor of a more radical program, and the people who wanted to do conventional electoral politics went off and did their thing and got state certification in a bunch of states, and then eventually ran Nader for president, and that became what the Greens is, and hasn't really budged much since then, except
Is
their
it
candidates
interesting-
have been successively less well known.
Isn't it interesting?
Let's hear
that-
what is social ecology, because
Yeah,
now we've heard
so,
what isn't
yeah.
it, so let's hear from more people about what it is.
Isn't it interesting that the Greens in
Sorry, no,
Germany
Paul, we're.
have ended up where they have?
Yeah.
The same problem.
Okay, Eleanor has called for other people to
I'm sorry?
talk,
Yeah.
so I'm just gonna assert that. Eleanor wants other people to talk.
Do we want to take stack? Are there a few folks who maybe would like to say something?
What's that?
Yeah. To take stack, to see if there are a few folks who might want to say something. Blair also maybe wants to say something. So we'll do Grace and Blair, and then we take a few more folks. Yeah.
Yeah, well, my experience is kind of like practicing social ecology before I knew what social ecology was. And having felt, you know, having found the affinity with social ecology after having done this work, and I was working as an organizer in the grassroots organic movement. And one of the things that I was involved with was like decentralizing an organization that was basically, you know, New England-wide, and making a charter that created autonomous state chapters that became affiliated through a confederation of the movement. And that all happened before I ever encountered the Institute for Social Ecology, when it was one of those things that I went, oh yeah, well, of course. That's the way, that's what needs to happen. We have to have self-governing, decentralized, you know, I didn't know anything about any of this theory, but that was my impulse as a, you know, 20-something community organizer, and being thrust into a leadership role I wasn't prepared for, all of this kind of thing. But the other piece that was really important to me in that constellation of ideas was the argument that was ongoing within that movement at the time about
You know, the importance of whether something was natural versus man-made, synthetic, came out of a laboratory kind of thing. And that was the determining factor for people about whether it should be organic or not. And I was arguing that that's kind of anti-human. You know, it's like, no, humans, a lot of the things that humans do are good and valuable and useful. And so that has been a controversy that's gone on and on and on. But that idea of of the reharmonization of people and nature became one of the guiding lights for me to really dig into what social ecology was all about and why that was the implications of all of it, the decentralism, the mutual aid, the democratic decision-making, the face-to-face, non-hierarchical, shared leadership models, which have, again, been elaborated much more of a deliberate fashion over the years. And, yeah, so that's my thing, you know, it's been kind of a dialectical process of forming ideas based on my own experience that were then validated by my exposure to the social ecology world, and it gave me support to continue arguing, holding those positions and reaching out to more people. So that's my viewpoint.
Yeah, Blair?
Yeah, two things. I mean, my first was to offer like a word of either modesty or caution about setting the bar too high, because practicing social ecology is a revolutionary movement, so we can't really practice what we want to practice within capitalist statecraft. I mean, to me, the idea of like, imagine, you know, the question, have you ever practiced socialism? Well, no, because I live in capitalism. So I think we don't want to demoralize ourselves by forgetting that, you know, this is like a further horizon, excuse me, for Colt. But the second part was like, okay, we can build movements that are pointed in that direction. And to me, the movement that was like most hopeful in that regard, and maybe this is all just our own generational biases. I mean, I'm hearing these things like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
For me, it was certainly the ultra globalization movement. And the reason why is this was a national movement. It used direct action. It was decentralized. It was directly democratic. It was against the electoral system. In 2000, the year I came here, we went directly to the RNC, like all of us from here, and got arrested, protested there. We all went to the DNC in LA and got shot with rubber bullets. So the same thing there. So it was like against representative democracy is anti-capitalist, and it was ecological. It was an ecological anti-capitalist primarily orientation. So like those four components were really like lodestars for that movement. And to me, that was like, and you know, there was a conversation about the kind of society we wanted to build, and there was a lot of active social ecologists. There was a lot of like passive, just kind of social ecological vision. So for me, that was like the high water mark of like left-wing organizing was pointing that direction. There was like glimmers of it with Occupy, but lacked some of those components as well.
Is there anyone else who'd like to go before Dan? Wait, is there anyone who feels like newer to the conversation? Maybe you're like, I'm still trying to figure all this out, but there's something that you thought, you know, still came to mind? Dan, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, I have two thoughts. The first is I was lucky enough, privileged enough to work with a group of Puerto Rican activists on the Lower East Side of New York in a neighborhood called Loisaida. And they were engaged in a completely social ecological project of reconstructing their neighborhood, which at that point was really a sort of archetypal ghetto, 40% abandoned buildings, vacant lots. And they approached the Institute to see if we could help, because they wanted to utilize what we called alternative technologies. So we worked with them, putting solar collectors on the roofs of abandoned buildings that they had rehabbed through a process known as sweat equity urban homesteading, developing detailed plans for the neighborhood, creating community gardens, fish farms, windmills on top. It was really a holistic attempt to recreate their neighborhoods, and they were very conscious and very self-conscious about an ecological framework on both the level of being holistic in their approach and dealing with the actual physical environment of the neighborhood. And it was an amazing experience, and at the same time creating neighborhood assemblies, quarterly town meetings based in direct democracy where they'd have 500 attendees, each of them, including 100 people representing other community organizations. They developed an alternative planning board which combated the city's official board. Anyway, all of these very just amazing for me. And it was a very open and multicultural movement. It was primarily Puerto Rican. The leadership was Puerto Rican, but they were very open and welcoming of other people. And for me, that was really a seminal experience. And it was visceral. I felt socially ecology. And then I'd say the other times that I've felt social ecology have been at mass demonstrations at Seabrook, at Occupy, and various marches and demonstrations where we have been exercising movement democracy, movement assemblies, etc. Moments that Marx called festivals of the oppressed, and what Hacking Bay called it a temporary autonomous zone. Except I want to experience permanent autonomous zones, not just temporary autonomous.
Eleanor said it lives in you as a seed.
But, those are other
Yeah, but we
moments where the
want
feeling.
seeds to grow.
Those are other moments where the
Yeah.
feeling really surfaces and I feel connected to other people in a special way.
Can I ask a quick question about, because I know Murray lectured about the forms of freedom. So although we're under capitalism, it sounds like we're talking about that, where, is that similar to what, does anyone else want to elaborate on that concept?
The forms of freedom.
Mhm.
I mean, what I think he means by that is institutional forms. And institutional forms necessarily being somewhat independent from human beings, right? Like in the way that all institutions are. You can swap out a president of a university, but that role of there being a president is still there. There's the institution of the school. And so when we think of the forms of freedom, it's what are the institutions that can advance human consciousness and ethical reason, which he saw as the assembly, right? And then the federation as an articulation upon that, and it's in some ways a more advanced or a more complex institution that's actualizing the same principles of mutualism and creativity and autonomy at a more complex scale. But then it's interesting that there's the assembly and then there's the federation. And in some ways we can describe those things in detail, but it seems to me that we're at a moment right now where we actually need to be thinking about more tools, and more forms of, more tools and more different forms of freedom, right? Like what are some of the different kinds of federations, or how can, how can we elaborate on libertarian municipalism, for example, right? Like there's so much, I feel like there's a certain vocabulary that Bookchin gave us that's been incredibly useful, and also in some ways we're starting to bump up against the edges of what that vocabulary can do, and we need more nuanced language to describe some of the other, some of the nuances, if that makes sense. Brian had something to say, and then Rob.
Yeah, one of the institutional forms that Murray was most inspired by and upbeat about was, of course, the town meeting tradition here in Vermont, which is, on one level, maybe the oldest surviving and thriving institution of direct democracy in the world. On the other hand, it has a lot of limitations, and we ran up against a lot of those limitations when we did a multi-year organizing campaign around the issue of GMOs, back when most people didn't yet know what genetically engineered organisms or foods were. It was a brand new issue. This was late 90s, early 2000s. We started organizing people to go to town meetings and pose resolutions against the growing of GMOs and calling for regulation and labeling and all of that. And one of the things that we were, as organizers and as social ecologists, most excited about was whether we could actually get towns to proactively take measures at the town level. But it turned out that people were so immersed in the existing institutional frameworks
Yeah.
that the overwhelming majority of people who got resolutions passed in their towns, and there were something like 85 of them
86, I think.
over the course of 3 or 4 years. And then there were another several dozen in surrounding states in New Hampshire, Maine, and Western Mass. The highest aspiration most of the organizers could reach for was to get the state legislature to pass something and to get their town to write a letter to their legislators to try to get them to pass something. And, you know, there were several attempts, and some of them were nominally successful. Of course, they were all severely watered down. So on the one hand, there was this tremendous grassroots education happening around this issue that at the time most people knew nothing about, and people were having to learn the issue well enough to present it in their town, because only the residents of the town can speak at a given town meeting and get petition signatures and all the rest. But we also really ran up against the limitations of that institution.
Yeah, Rob, and then how are folks feeling? I'm starting to feel pretty tired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I ask one question? I'm just curious if people are involved in Indivisible.
Rob has a question, then we can get to that after, and then.
I guess, yeah, I don't have a forms of freedom comment, but I was more having a question about the social ecology vocabularies kind of, and like social ecology framework. You've talked about exploring different movements across the world. You know, you mentioned solidarity economy, shares many kind of core values with social ecology, whether it's kind of democracy or, you know, ecology. And, you know, there's many different movements and theories and perspectives around the world that overlap a lot with social ecology and kind of share many kind of core values. But social ecology is also something very specific and presents a kind of unique analysis. So my question for you is, like, through your travels and whatnot, beyond some of the kind of relationships that bring you back here that, you know, you've cultivated over a decade, and like, what are some of the things about social ecology that stands out to you as like this unique thing that has you kind of remain committed to it as a kind of movement theory?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is a really interesting question, because it's true. It's like you do, like I know I keep coming back to it as like a touchstone, and I think there are a lot of folks who have that, you know, kind of like relationship. And I think to me, you know, like thinking about, right, like the uniqueness. And I just want to flag quickly, like a piece of language that I like to use to describe that is like a family of social movements, right? Or a family, like we're a part of a family of movements. They're saying a lot of similar things, you know? There's a movement of movements going on globally, of which social ecology is one of them. And I see that as a proof of concept of these ideas. Like the fact that they arise in different places in different times is a testament to their validity. But yeah, 100%, like you're right, like social ecology is also unique. And I think one of the things that makes social ecology unique is the analysis of natural evolution in in secular scientific terms. And we can look at the evolution of consciousness, over the last, what is it, like 3 billion, well, I guess life is 3 billion years old, or I always forget, yeah, life is 3 billion years old, and, this notion of like looking at the qualitative development of consciousness, of cooperation, and understanding human society as a qualitative shift in that evolution. So, I mean, in some ways, I'm just describing, first, second, third nature. That I think is fundamentally sound and is able to describe those things at a level of nuance that I've, not really been able to find anywhere else. Yeah, I don't know, like thinking about things like the Cambrian explosion and the evolution of like digits and eyes and ears and things, like we take all of those things for granted, but like they're really developed over hundreds of millions of years. And to have that sense, like one of my favorite facts, and I think I mentioned this in the book, and I don't know, there's a section of the book where I talk about the Cambrian explosion. I wanted to just like nerd out on it, but I realized like, where is this going? But like, that really struck me when I was reading about it, that like for the first like, I don't know, like 25 million years or something, or 50 million years, like animals didn't interact with each other. Like they existed, but they literally just like wandered around on the seafloor, like eating detritus. They didn't, like there was no means to interact with each other, and it took millions of years for there to be like claws or fangs and like the idea of predation. And so again, it's like we take social life for granted, but actually, it's something that's had to evolve over time, and there's just some, and that that human consciousness and human ethics and our belief in a right and wrong is rooted in that evolution, to me is like that in many ways is like, that's like the touchstone, right? And that the relating the politics back to ecology, and to say like democracy has has an ecological basis that's not reductive to the ecological, right? It's not just a metaphor. It's how are we fostering, diversity genuinely? How are we, advancing, ethical thought? Like actually I remember Ben Groscup actually really like gave me an aha moment when I was really young. I was like, well, how do you know about like, first and second, second nature, and like ethics being rooted in, and in nature? Like I just wasn't grasping it. And he was like, freedom, the concept of freedom is in our minds. It's in the evolution of our minds. It's biologically like rooted in our minds. And I'm tired, so I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but I had this like aha moment of like, oh, we're biologically wired to think of this. We're this, that notion of like being nature rendered self-conscious, that there is an objectivity to ethics. Haya talks about objectivity being a spectrum, right? There's subjectivity, very hard on the left, like personal opinion, and then there's like mathematics, over on the other side. But there is an objectivity to reason and ethics and to democratic politics, and then that sort of leading into the notion of the political, the apolitical, and the irrational, and the connection of rationality to democratic politics, and again, I'm really tired, so I'm not describing it well. And now I'm just like, the social ecology is the social ecology. But yeah, like all of those, yeah, like the nature philosophy to me is really unique. And I don't know, I guess another way to look at it, like libertarian municipalism is also genuinely really, like nobody's talking about like an entry into local institutions, vestigial institutions and all that stuff is, I'm rambling. So there's another, yeah.
It was a good ramble.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of circling back to some things that you mentioned, just Grace, how, like, I kind of resonate with what you said. I feel like I keep coming here because I resonate with so much, but I haven't felt the moment. And I think it's because I struggle in my sphere in healthcare, and I feel like you're talking about maybe needing new vocabularies or an expansion into different areas, and I feel like that is an area that may benefit from exploration, especially now considering, our health is being constructed in a whole new trajectory as a society. And what that means and what would social ecology, how would we talk about it, like as a kind of way to create a grounding.
Now that we've made it plastic.
Is that it? You done? Okay.